Author event. Herb Boyd discusses Black Detroit, a people's history of self-determination.
Oh, what a wonderful turnout. I took a photo. I hope you don't mind. You know, I don't have moments like this all the time. I wanted to record it and show other folks that they can do some stuff too, you know. But this is Ann Arbor, and you know, the state of Michigan has been very good to me, and the gift that continues to give, you know, with Black Detroit, the book, People's History of Self-Determination, and getting the notable book award, you know, from the state of the Library of Michigan, and then having an opportunity to speak at the University of Michigan's library, which I visited today, and now here in Ann Arbor at the library. The third time is charmed. Yeah, right on point, you know, unless Ann Arbor High School hits in, huh? But that's absolutely amazing, and I'm looking at how diverse this audience is at the same time, and to be surrounded by all of this wonderful calligraphy, none of which I can read. We can say a few words, you know, with Ohio and Konnichiwa. We can say Ayang Haseo. We can say Ni hao mao, ni hao mao, you know. I learned all that from the lottery man in my neighborhood in Harlem. They teach me Chinese, and I teach them slang, Harlem slang. But you know, this is, the book has been out a year and a half now, and ordinarily, if you don't know that, a book customarily has about 14 days of shelf life. After that, it gives away to the other 75,000 books that are published each year. So you can understand how absolutely thrilled and fortunate I am to continue a year and a half later, still get invitations to come out and speak about the book. It must be some resonance with that book. It must be some traction that it has. And my wife always reminds me, she says, well, Herb, it's a good book. And I say, yeah, but there's a lot of good books out there that don't get half the opportunity. So you have to feel somewhat blessed that are all of the books that are published each year, that you continue to get all of the praise and the opportunities to speak to audiences. I think much of it had to do with getting some glorious reviews, you know, from the New York Times, the Washington Post, two small publications. They did, Thomas Sugru, who's just an outstanding historian and a friend of mine now. Anytime you get a good review, you got a new friend. And Thomas is just an amazing urbanologist. His book, you know, on the urban crisis is just indispensable. And I'd like to always give a shout out to my colleagues, my writers. They come out and help me, and I try to help them. In fact, I was just trying to think, and I was telling Ms. Hussein exactly what process do you use, which angle, strategy, what narrative that would be excite me, because I've just about used them up in terms of talking about the book. Episodically is probably the easiest way to do it, because every decade in the 300 years of Detroit's history, there's a very remarkable event, a pivotal moment that you can build on, whether you go all the way back to 1701, when it was discovered, when the French arrived, I'll say it like that, all the way down to the bankruptcy. And it's a long stretch of history. And of course, the easy thing for me was to focus on the African-American community. That was something that I had studied, I knew. I came of age in that city, although I left it some 37 years ago, living in New York, living in Harlem now. But it's something like Josephine Baker was a great chanteuse back in the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance. A few of you here may know something about the 1920s in a very intimate and real way. And she had this great song, J'ai deux amours, J'ai deux amours, two loves have I, France and of course Paris. And I have two loves, Harlem and Detroit. It's a kind of a soul and spirit thing that goes on. But I never miss an opportunity to go back to Detroit, for the most part, because my mother is still there. And she was, if you read over the book, it's part memoir, it's part autobiography, it's part biography, it's part love letter. It's the repertorial aspects of it, but it's really my mother's story. And she's 98 now and still pretty clear, you know. The only differences we have is the number of places we lived in the city of Detroit. You know, sometimes I can challenge her on the chronological order in which we moved around that city. And the only argument we have is like, no, Black Bottom came before 8 Mile Road, you know, that kind of thing, you know, so we get those things straight. But I thought that maybe a unique approach we can use this evening with you is to base it upon some of the reaction, some of the calls that I've received over the last several days. About a couple of days ago, I got an email from one of my colleagues. He's a professor, historian, and he's working on a book on Charles Diggs. Now, some of you know how important he was in the history, the city's history, Detroit's history, in terms of its political evolution. In fact, I almost see him, if not him, his father, as being almost the foundation of the beginning of the Black emergence on the political scene. So Professor Orr got in touch with me and said, Herb, I'm working on this book on Charles Diggs, and I see where you discussed him a bit in Black Detroit. I say, yeah, but it needs a further examination, a further exposition. He says, that's what I'm going to do. I'm doing a biography on Charles Diggs, and I would hope that you would blurb it. You know, you want me to blurb it before you write it? He says, just be with me on this here project. I said, don't worry about it, and I'll help you as much as I can in terms of getting him the resources and giving the guidance that he needs to understand the significance, you know, of the Diggs family. The Diggs family, now Charles Diggs, the most important of the Diggses is Charles Jr. His father was a state senator, and of course they had the burial services, the funeral parlors that was down in Black Bottom, and very, very upstairs over the funeral parlor, that's where Coleman Young lived. So you can see right away there's going to be a connection, and I try to connect up these families across these 300 years of Detroit's Black history. And the Diggs family stands out because Charles Jr., now he's the first elected African-American to Congress, the first state, he's the representative out of Detroit, the first. And of course, later is going to be John Conyers and a few others after that, Carolyn Kilpatrick and what have you. But Diggs, Charles Diggs Jr. is the beginning. And what a remarkable individual he was. I mean, here's someone who was tireless in his advocacy of the civil rights movement to begin with. I mean, no one was as committed, as determined, as consistently involved as Charles Diggs was in the civil rights movement. And beyond that, you know, the whole Black liberation struggle, you can find him. There's a photo in the book of him with the dashiki on, showing his connection, to the Black Liberation Movement. The whole African Liberation Day down in Washington, D.C., he was one of the keynote speakers there. So from an ideological standpoint, there was no separation, no division for him, although there was quite an argument and quite a provocative one between Black nationalists and those who were on the left, the Marxist, Leninists, and what have you over the years. But Charles didn't draw that line. He straddled that line and tried to kind of bring those communities of activists together and show that you have a common cause here. And I'm going to stand resolute, as a partisan for each of your struggles. So you have him involved. How many of you ever heard of Emmett Till? That is a very key American story. Tragic, but that's part of this country's history. When they had his trial, the trial for the two men who had been accused and charged and put on trial for that murder. Of course, you can't use murder because that's a legal term, and they never really convicted these individuals. They walked. But Emmett Till was this 14-year-old kid who was visiting his parents. This is in Money, Mississippi, in August of 1955. I had a chance to really get close to the story because when Keith Beauchamp was putting out his documentary on the untold story of Louis Emmett Till, and he came to New York City, I had a chance to meet not only Mamie Mobley, Emmett Till's mother, but also Simeon Wright, his first cousin, who was sleeping in the bed with Emmett Till when he was abducted. And I just told, they had been really badgering Simeon to tell his story, but he was so reluctant to do that. And I understood, Keith was saying, Herb, you need to do the story with him. And I said, no, I'm not going to badger him on that. I'll just leave it, let him think about it. And about a year and a half later, he had thought about it enough. He got in touch with me and said, let's do it. And he brought me in touch with all of the corrections that was necessary in telling that story, because there was a lot of misinformation out there about Emmett Till and what had happened with that incident. But when the trial got underway down in Sumner, Mississippi, there was one individual who was almost there daily, and that was Charles Diggs. He had just defied them, although he had to sit, he went and he sat in the black section, the so-called Negro colored section of the courtroom. But outside of that courtroom, he held press conferences, and he began to talk about the kind of degradation, how reprehensible, in other words, voicing his own opinions and putting forth his own judgment long before the jury would reach theirs. Of course, neither of the men were convicted. They both walked, and later on confessed to it for $4,000 to William Bradford Huey. Charles Diggs brought that story to Michigan. He brought it to Detroit. In fact, when you look at the Diggs story, part of it is right here in Ann Arbor, because he went to the University of Michigan for a couple of years, and then went to other universities, and finally in Detroit and College of Law, and on into the political arena where he established a very enviable reputation. When South Africa, when the winds of change blew across South Africa and the liberation movements began to emerge, there was Charles Diggs again, supporting, the struggle against the Portuguese colonialism, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Angola, Principe, Fernando Po. Charles Diggs was there. He was an ardent foe of apartheid. He spoke out relentlessly against the kind of oppression the brutal oppression that was going on in South Africa at that time, and ultimately became a good friend, of all of these revolutionaries who were fighting with the African National Congress. That's just a snapshot in terms of his commitment, how Charles Diggs, not only as a representative, because when they put together the Congressional Black Caucus, CBC, he was the first chairperson. And there's only a couple of those individuals still with us who were founding members. In fact, I was just with one of them a couple of days ago, and that was Charles Rangel. And of course, John Conyers, he continues, but he's no longer there. In fact, they've got a whole new election going on. That's another discussion we can talk about in terms of the politics of the current political situation in Detroit and in Michigan. Of course, we just had the primaries and everything, so I imagine that resonates with a number of you voters out there. I see some of these younger people, I guess you didn't get there yet, but make sure you register and get out there and voice, and put your voice and your shoulder to the wheel in the same way that Charles Diggs did. He was just an unflinching foe, of any kind of unrighteous, the kind of impolitic indifference that occurred, particularly with the people of color in this country. So remember Charles Diggs, and I'm hoping that Professor Orr, continue and put his book together so we can know a little bit more definitively of what he was all about. I only have like 5 or 6 pages in the book about him, but he warrants and quite worthy of a full exposition, a full biography. The other call, along with Professor Orr, I got a call from a young lady who's working on murals. I wonder if she's here. Her name is Rebecca, and she knew about this here particular event and got in touch with me and wanted to know what did I know about the history of murals, these paintings, particularly during the 1960s, the late 60s, across the country, the walls of respect, what have you. I told her I couldn't give her any kind of precise or any full discussion on that, but I know some people who can, some artists, some activists who are involved in those kind of efforts, initiatives. And I thought of Chaz Miller. Now, Chaz Miller is an artist, and in the book, that's right, Lander, you and Sheila can see it right there in the book, that wall that he took a negative and turned it into a positive. I can talk about that wall in a very personal way because I live two streets over on Pinehurst, and the wall was called the Burwood Wall because it went down between Burwood and Mendota. I lived on Pinehurst. So that was my introduction to living out in the far west side on 8 Mile Road. And we used to get on that wall. It was almost like being on, you see some of the gymnastics where they do the board, the beam. The wall was just about as wide as that beam. And we would challenge each other, see who could walk, because it was it goes about 4 long blocks, 3.5 long blocks. And you see who could walk the wall without falling off and do certain other kind of things on that wall to show your acrobatic skills and what have you. And we would play up against that wall. But this is in the 1950s, after I moved out of Black Bottom and moved out to 8 Mile Road. Of course, 8 Mile Road is now famous for Eminem, the rapper, and what have you. But back in those days, that wall was built to separate the black and the white community. It was done in the early 40s. When we moved out there, we didn't know anything about that wall because we were like the first family to move on Pinehurst. And then we began to get some indication, but we just wanted to get a nice little cottage, a nice home, out of the bottom, try to get toward garage and a backyard and a front yard, and having an opportunity to go to better schools and everything. So that was the opportunity we got moving out to the 8 Mile Road region. But that wall is interesting that Chaz would come along and put a mural on that, and you have to see it. And in the book, you have a good photo shot to show exactly how he put all of this history up on that wall. Probably the most gripping, the most vivid part of that display is a shot of Rosa Parks, getting off the bus. And of course, Rosa Parks and her connection with the bus. But he tried to capture the kind of movement that was going on. Later, of course, Rosa's going to move and live in Detroit many, many years and work with John Conyers and what have you. And of course, she's much a part of that history, particularly from the 1950s to her death, as being like one of the principal movers and shakers in that city when it comes to struggle. Rosa was just indefatigable in her fight for justice. So anyway, there's a wall out there, and I'm talking to this young lady, and I say, well, look, you should go out there and take a look at the wall because that's a part of your discussion. It was not put up in the same way. I don't think Chaz, the artist, necessarily, this is recent because the murals that she's talking about, the Wall of Respect and all these things that almost kind of came of age as the graffiti movement was developing in the Bronx in New York City. But a little bit more political content because it was saying things about Black power and Black nationalism. So that's what those murals were all about. But it was just getting the call from Rebecca and thinking about the call I had received from Professor Orr. And then I got a call from Sidney Bothwell. And I hadn't heard his voice in a long time. And he was calling to thank me for shining a light on his family, the Bothwell family. His father was Sidney Bothwell Sr., and he had 11 drugstores in Detroit. Is that right, Donald? 11 of them, and all the different flavors, beyond Basket and Robbins, what he had there. And we would go there for the soda fountain was a key thing for us. It was right on the corner of Russell and Alger. And in 1943, when they had the race riot, and we say riot, not rebellion, because it was really a riot or hostility, very, very brutal hostility that went down, with the communities of color against particularly against the police at that time. That's 1943. And we lived on the north end then, and Bothwell's drugstore was right on Russell Street there, and all of the white-owned businesses were just vandalized, either burned down or bricks thrown through the window and everything. But Bothwell's was spared. It was the only store that was spared. And I mean, during the '67 rebellion, you had a lot of the stores putting signs up there, soul brother. In other words, spared, don't bother me, I'm a soul brother. But of course, many of them were not soul brothers at all, but they tried to protect their property. But Bothwell's, the people in the community knew what that particular business was all about and how it catered to the Black community. So I'm talking to Sidney, and Sidney was my student at Wayne State University, and he came along at a time, Lander, almost with you when you were at the Wayne State University's law school, and all those other distinguished members that followed behind the legendary Kenny Cockrell. But Sidney reminded me of, first of all, his sister is Kosawa, who's a very fine activist in New York. And again, you talk about the Bothwells and you talk about the Diggses, these illustrious families that come out of Detroit. In the book, I talk about the Pelham family going all the way back to the 19th century. when they had the first black newspaper in the city. This was the plain dealer they had there. And the Pelham family were very instrumental, in movers and shakers in every particular walk of life in the city's history at the time. And from one generation to another, too. The Diggs family would have the same thing. There would be Charles Sr., and then Jr., and then Charles Diggs III, who's out in, I think, Phoenix, Arizona now, where he's an MBA and not involved at all in the political arena, but carrying on that whole professional tradition, that's so much a part of the African-American community. See, Detroit, when you look at its history, is inseparable from the automobile industry, and I try to capture a bit of that story also, but that's like an odyssey. That's a huge undertaking because you have to go all the way back, and some of the individuals who were involved with Henry Ford are not even talked about. Innovative, these beyond being tinkerers and inventors as Elijah McCoy, the real McCoy. Of course, he's got that connection to Detroit as well. But it's important to see this whole working class energy that's so much a part of the community. The Orr, for Professor Orr, you talk about Rebecca, Sydney. On August the 16th, the whole country was shook up when Aretha Franklin joined the Ancestors. And I was scheduled to speak at the Jazz Festival, Michael, and came at the same time that all of the week-long activity, for Aretha Franklin. 4 days of tribute to her legend. And of course, I grew up with the Franklin family. Her father was Reverend C.L. Franklin. If you ever get a chance, you check out, some of those early recordings that he did. The eagle stirreth her nest. It's just an outstanding piece of sermon where you have this here conjunction where a sermon is mixed in with singing, and he could vocalize. You can see that the fruit never falls that far from the tree. And the kind of resonance and mellifluous aspects of his voice, the whole guttural thing to say nothing of that kind of sermonic thing that was so much a part of the Baptist preachers, getting down, deep down, and speaking in tongues and what have you. No one could do it like Reverend C.L. Franklin. And I thought about him and running from the New Bethel Baptist Church. From the church then to Shane Park, where Shahida Mausi is doing a remarkable job there, the tribute they had for Aretha there. And then to Greater Grace, the church, which is a palatial church out there on 7 Mile Road. And, some 4,000 to 5,000 to 6,000 people turned out to say farewell to the Queen. So all of this stuff was, a part of, I don't have that much about Aretha in the book, but it's enough there. And I was close to her brother, Cecil. In fact, Cecil was very much involved in the political arena, the Poor People's Campaign. Back just before Dr. King's assassination, he was talking about a Poor People's Campaign. That's why he was down in Memphis. He was down there with those sanitation workers, standing up for them. When he was taken from us. But he was concerned beyond just talking about the kind of struggle that we as Black people have in this country, but what poor people are facing. And so he pulled together the Poor People's Campaign. Well, Cecil Franklin, Aretha's brother, headed up the Detroit branch of the Poor People's Campaign. And when a group of them, some 600 of them, came to Detroit in preparation for going down to D.C. to set up the tent city that later on they would do. and at Cobo Arena had a confrontation with the police. It was the only incident out of all the things that happened with the Poor People's Campaign, it had to happen in Detroit. Of course, you know, you start looking at the history of violence in the city, it's a long and checkered one. You know, I mean, when you talk about the '67 rebellion, that's one that's caught. I mean, we've had like the Algiers Motel incident, the film that came out, Catherine Bigelow's film, caused quite a bit of controversy. People figured that, you know, some who lined up behind her believing that it's about time somebody talked about that and discussed it and gave it some kind of filmic or cinematic discussion. However, others figured that it didn't go far enough, it didn't go deep enough. It didn't cover some other very important aspects of that rebellion. But that's another discussion. That shows that Detroit just continues to be in the news in so many different ways. I picked up the paper this morning and talk about, oh, Detroit, you know, is no longer the murder capital #1. You know, St. Louis and went ahead of y'all, you know, so that no matter if it's good, bad, or otherwise, you talk about industry, Detroit. You talk about the music. I had come to the Jazz Festival, where I ended up with all the Aretha Franklin events, but I had come to talk about two important women in the history of the music in the city and beyond. The harpist, Dorothy Ashby, the vibist pianist, Terry Pollard. Two Black women who are often ignored when you look at the history of the music, history of jazz in the city of Detroit. And over the years, I've been quite intimately involved, you know, in the music scene there. I mean, when you go all the way back to, when you go back to Paradise Valley, as I did as a child, and you heard all of the great musicians as a kid at the Flame Show Bar, when you all do, standing outside of Lee's Sensation, ear up to the door, or going over to the Bluebird Inn, and looking through the window there and seeing all these giants of the music come through. So that thing was like embedded in me. And if the music jumps out of that book, that's because I was so deeply involved in helping to promote the music scene there as a writer and struggling musician at one point. But more than anything is the institutions and the organizations, even the recording companies. Everybody talk about Berry Gordy. I mean, you say Detroit, the first two words out of your mouth is the automobile industry and Berry Gordy, Motown Records. And that stands to reason in terms of the mark that they've made, you know, on our society. But it's always more than just one or two moments or one or two institutions that make for the power of a particular culture and society. That's what I try to do in Black Detroit, is bring some of these other elements, some of the unsung, unheralded individuals, some of those teachers that I had, you know, when I was at Moore School and Sherrard and Brackmeyer, you know, when I went on to Northwestern High School, when I went on to Wayne State University, where I was surrounded by a number of activists. And it was just a hotbed of political activism at Wayne State University in the 1960s. You can't imagine, you know, and how the impact that it had on other institutions too. Because they always talk about Cornell University, Howard University, University of California, Berkeley, what happened at Columbia. But we had it at Wayne State University. And part of telling the story about self-determination is to make sure you talk about those workers who came out of Dodge, Maine. I almost spent 3 months there. It was enough. I mean, it was, you know, trying to do that work on the line with 73 cars an hour. It was backbreaking. It was a killing. And that's why a number of the workers there began to, you know, protest the situation, the whole wildcat strike, because they figured the UAW was not properly representing the Black workers. In fact, at one time, we said UAW meant for us, you ain't white. But the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, that was one of those pivotal, prominent organizations that came out that time that had like national impact. Other plants picked up on the kind of revolutionary activity that was going on, battling against this whole anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racism. All of those things were part and parcel of the cry, the mantra that we had at that time. And Wayne State University, again, is right in the middle of that. The whole Black Studies movement. You start looking at that right at Wayne State University. So that's just very, very easy for me to talk about a lot of these things, because just recalling some of my own, tracks, some of my own tears, some of my own victories. But more than anything, it's my mother's story. It's my brother's story, it's my sister's story. It's our family too. Yeah, you had the Pelhams. Yes, you had the Diggses. You had the Bothwells. You had the Cole family, the Kilpatricks. But there was also the Browns. It was ones who were struggling. One member being who was fighting against stress. Hayward Brown and John Percy Boyd and Mark Bethune, who was my student at Wayne State University, against these here rogue cops who was vamping on the African-American community, young men who were trying to eliminate drugs in the community and intercepted police officers on a payoff, and a shootout occurred. And it led to one of the massive manhunts in the city. So I can talk about that in a very real way in terms of the family being involved. But it's not so much my family as our families that we had there. Because it took all of us. It took about a village, to raise a child. Well, it takes a community to elevate a people. And that's what we had at that time. And I'm glad to see that spirit is not dead. I talk about that toward the end of the book, where we look at where people picked up the inspiration from a previous generation and began to apply that to their own struggle. Because some of those issues that was pertinent in 1960 and 1940 are still there, haven't gone anywhere. So you have to kind of rejuvenate, revive, renew that struggle to bring about change. I like to think that Black Detroit is a weapon, that it's a part of that struggle, that it begins to capture some of those individuals who were no longer with us. And there's a whole roster of those individuals who were close to me, who are gone. I wish I'd had a chance to have them talk to me about their stories before they left. But I got enough of them, I think. But as we always say, that decision belongs to you. Thank you.
This program was recorded on September 25th, 2018, at the Ann Arbor District Library.